for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host today. The mother of the Oxford shooter has been found guilty of involuntary manslaughter for her role in her son's murder of 4 fellow students. This is a big deal. We are going to talk about that. Trump is not immune from prosecution, according to the U.S. Appeals Court out of Washington, D.C. It looks like the Supreme Court's going to look at the 14th Amendment and whether Trump is allowed on the ballot. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about today. Before we get to today's topics, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us at X, the former Twitter, at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. I do know that Google Podcasts is going to shut down at the beginning of April. So if you listen to us on Google Podcasts, I highly recommend you switch either to Spreaker or Apple Podcasts. That way we can track you and we know who's listening and where you're listening. So please do that. Like I said, if you're on Google Podcasts right now, I'd switch to either Spreaker or Apple Podcasts. Also, don't forget that we send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern, and you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and WMTB St. Petersburg, Florida. Be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. If they're not carrying us, please ask them nicely to do so. Let's get to our first story. This is out of Pontiac, Michigan. This is Ed White and Corey Williams writing for the Associated Press. This is dated February 6th. We are recording this show on Wednesday, February 7th, 2024. A Michigan jury convicted a school shooter's mother of involuntary manslaughter Tuesday in the killing of 4 students in 2021, making her the first parent in the U.S. to be held responsible for a child carrying out a mass school attack. Prosecutors say Jennifer Crumbley had a duty under state law to prevent her son, who was 15 at the time, from harming others. She was accused of failing to secure a gun and ammunition at home and failing to get help to support Ethan Crumbley's mental health. The 4 guilty verdicts, one for each student slain at Oxford High School, were returned after roughly 11 hours of jury deliberations. 45-year-old Jennifer Crumbley looked down and shook her head slightly as each juror was polled after the verdicts were read. On her way out of the courtroom, prosecutor Karen McDonald hugged Craig Schilling, the father of victim Justin Schilling, and the family of Madison Baldwin. A man whispered to her, "Thank you." Jennifer and James Crumbley were the first parents in the U.S. to be charged in a mass school shooting committed by their child. James Crumbley faces trial next month. Craig Schilling told reporters, quote, "The cries have been heard, and I feel this verdict is going to echo throughout every household in the country. I feel it's necessary, and I'm happy with the verdict. It's still a sad situation to be in. It's got to stop. It's an accountability, and this is what we've been asking for a long time now," end of quote. A gag order by the judge prevented McDonald and defense attorney Shannon Smith from speaking to reporters. On the morning of November 30th, 2021, school staff members were concerned about a violent drawing of a gun, bullet, and wounded man, accompanied by desperate phrases on Ethan Crumbley's math assignment. His parents were called to the school for a brief meeting, but they did not take the boy home. A few hours later, Ethan Crumbley pulled a handgun from his backpack and shot 10 students and a teacher. No one had checked the backpack. The gun was the Sig Sauer 9mm his father had purchased with him just 4 days earlier. Jennifer Crumbley had taken her son to a shooting range that same weekend. While cross-examining the mother last week, Assistant Prosecutor Mark Keast said, quote, "You're the last adult to have possession of that gun. You saw your son shoot the last practice round before the school shooting on November 30th. You saw how he stood. He knew how to use the gun." End of quote. Jennifer Crumbley replied, quote, "Yes, he did." End of quote. Besides 17-year-old Justin Schilling and 17-year-old Madison Baldwin, Hannah St. Juliana, 14, and 16-year-old Tate Meyer were also killed. 7 people were wounded. Ethan Crumbley, now 17, pled guilty to murder and terrorism. He is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Jennifer Crumbley told jurors that it was her husband's job to keep track of the gun. She also said that she saw no signs of mental distress in her son. She testified, quote, "We would talk. We did a lot of things together. I trusted him, and I felt I had an open door. He could come to me about anything." End of quote. In a journal found by police, Ethan Crumbley wrote that his parents wouldn't listen to his pleas for help. He wrote, quote, "I have zero help for my mental problems, and it's causing me to shoot up the school." End of quote. The words with the drawing that prompted a counselor to call the Crumbleys to the school said, quote, "The thoughts won't stop. Help me. The world is dead. My life is useless." End of quote. Prosecutors introduced evidence that Ethan Crumbley texted his mother in the spring of 2021 about demons throwing bowls and other hallucinations. But she told the jury that it was, quote, "just Ethan messing around." End of quote. She continued testimony, quote, "I have asked myself if I would have done anything different. I wouldn't have. I wish he would have killed us instead." End of quote. The jury of 6 men and 6 women included people who owned guns or grew up with them in their home. The jurors said they could put their opinions about guns aside and serve fairly. Jennifer Crumbley will get credit for roughly 2.5 years in the county jail when she returns to court for sentencing on April 9th. The judge will set the minimum prison sentence based on scoring guidelines and other factors. It will be up to the Michigan Parole Board to determine how long she actually stays in prison. The maximum term for involuntary manslaughter is 15 years. Prosecutors have not said if they will ask for consecutive sentences on the 4 convictions, which could mean a mandated maximum 60 years if Judge Cheryl Matthews agrees. I hope they go after consecutive sentences. That's what she deserves. 15 years is not nearly enough for 4 lives. Sorry, I have no sympathy for her. None whatsoever. She saw the warning signs, she ignored them. She can now pay the price for what her son did because she's equally as culpable as well. She should have had that handgun locked up somewhere, but she didn't. People, there's reasons why cops have trigger locks that you can get. You can pick them up for free at the county sheriff's office, the Michigan State Police. They have them just there for the asking. All you gotta do is ask for one. And yes, you can go and buy them elsewhere if you want, but good Lord, there's no excuse for this. None. No excuse for the murder of 4 people and the wounding of 7 others. There just isn't. I don't have the words. I hope that the father goes to trial as well, and I hope he gets the same verdict and the same sentence. They deserve, both of them deserve 60 years in prison. You can quote me on that. Right now, let's go to our next story here. This is Eric Tucker and Alana Durkin Richard writing for the Associated Press. This is also dated February 6th out of Washington. This is great news. A federal appeals panel ruled Tuesday that Donald Trump can face trial on charges that he plotted to overturn the results of the 2020 election, sharply rejecting Trump's claims that he is immune from prosecution while setting the stage for additional challenges that could further delay the case. This article refers to Trump as former president. We don't do that on this show. The ruling is significant not only for its stark repudiation of Trump's novel immunity claims, but also because it breathes life back into a landmark prosecution that had been effectively frozen for weeks as the court considered the appeal. Yet the 1-month gap between when the court heard arguments and issued its ruling has already created uncertainty about the timing of a trial in a calendar-jammed election year, with the judge overseeing the case last week canceling the initial March 4th date. Trump's team vowed to appeal, which could postpone the case by weeks or months, particularly if the Supreme Court agrees to take it up. The appeals panel, which includes 2 appointees by President Joe Biden and 1 Republican-appointed judge, gave Trump a week to ask the Supreme Court to get involved. The eventual trial date carries enormous political ramifications, with special counsel Jack Smith's team hoping to prosecute Trump this year, and the Republican front-runner seeking to delay it until after the November election. If Trump were to defeat Biden, he could presumably try to use his position as head of the executive branch to order a new attorney general to dismiss the federal cases he faces, or potentially could seek a pardon for himself, which would be unprecedented. Tuesday's unanimous ruling is the second time since December that judges have held that Trump can be prosecuted for actions undertaken while in the White House and in the run-up to January 6, 2021, when a mob of his traitorous supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol. I added traitorous because that's what they are. They are, they were, and they always will be traitors. The opinion, which had been expected given the skepticism with which the panel greeted the Trump team's arguments, was unsparing in its repudiation of Trump's novel claim that former presidents enjoy absolute immunity for actions that fall within their official job duties. The court wrote, quote, "For the purpose of this criminal case, former President Trump has become Citizen Trump with all of the defenses of any other criminal defendant. But any executive immunity that may have protected him while he served as president no longer protects him against this prosecution." End of quote. The judges said the public interest in criminal accountability, quote, "outweighs the potential risk of chilling presidential action." End of quote. Turning aside the claim that a president has, quote, "unbounded authority to commit crimes," end of quote, that would prevent the recognition of election results or violate the rights of citizens to vote. The judges wrote, quote, "We cannot accept that the office of the presidency places its former occupants above the law for all time thereafter," end of quote. A Trump spokesman said Tuesday that Trump would appeal the ruling, quote, "in order to safeguard the presidency and the Constitution," end of quote. Safeguard the presidency and the Constitution. Yeah. No, what he's doing is he's trying to safeguard himself from going to prison so that he doesn't get held accountable for the crimes that he allegedly committed. And I'm being fair when I say allegedly committed. I say he committed them. You want my honest opinion? Continuing the story, and in a post on Truth Social after the ruling was issued, Trump insisted that a president, quote, "must have full immunity in order to properly function and do what is to be done for the good of our country," end of quote. Really? Donald Trump is facing 4 criminal indictments and a civil lawsuit. Yes, he is. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit took center stage in the immunity dispute after the Supreme Court in December said it was at least temporarily staying out, rejecting a request from Smith's team to take up the matter quickly and issue a speedy ruling. But the High Court could yet decide to act on a Trump appeal. There is no timetable for the Supreme Court to act, but the justices are likely to seek Smith's input before deciding whether to keep the legal rulings against Trump in place. If the court declines to consider the appeal, U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan would be able to restart the trial proceedings. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Court accedes to Trump's request, any timetable it establishes would determine how much longer the trial might be delayed. If the court grants Trump's request without speeding up the appeals process, Trump would likely have until early May before he would need to file his full appeal, but the justices could set much quicker deadlines for reaching a final decision. The Supreme Court has previously held that presidents are immune from civil liability for official acts and Trump's lawyers have for months argued that the protection should be extended to criminal prosecution as well. They said the actions Trump was accused of in his failed bid to cling to power after he lost the 2020 election, including badgering his vice president to refuse to certify the results of the election, all fell within the outer perimeters of a president's official acts. But Smith's team has said that no such immunity exists in the U.S. Constitution or in prior cases, and that in any event, Trump's actions weren't part of his official duties. Judge Chutkan, who is presiding over the case, rejected Trump's arguments in a December opinion that said the office of the president, quote, does not confer a lifelong get-out-of-jail-free pass, end of quote. Trump's lawyers then turned to the D.C. Appeals Court, but Smith asked the Supreme Court to weigh in first in hopes of securing a fast and definitive ruling and preserving the March 4th trial date. The High Court declined the request, leaving the matter with the Appeals Court. The case was argued before Judges Florence Pan and J. Michelle Childs, appointees of Biden, a Democrat, and Karen LaCraft Henderson, who was named to the bench by President George H.W. Bush, a Republican. So 3 women on the court there. Good. The judges made clear their skepticism of Trump's claims during arguments last month when they peppered his lawyer with questions and posed a series of extreme hypotheticals to test his legal theory of immunity, including whether a president who directed Navy commandos to assassinate a political rival could be prosecuted. Trump's lawyer, D. John Sauer, answered yes, but only if a president had first been impeached and convicted by Congress. That view was in keeping within the team's position that the Constitution did not permit the prosecution of ex-presidents who had been impeached but then acquitted, like Trump. The case in Washington is one of 4 prosecutions Trump faces as he seeks to reclaim the White House. He faces federal charges in Florida that he illegally retained classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago estate, a case that was also brought by Smith and is set for trial in May. He is also charged in state court in Georgia with scheming to subvert that state's 2020 election, and in New York in connection with hush money payments made to porn actor Stormy Daniels. He has denied any wrongdoing. By the way, the state court case in Georgia would have nothing to do with the Supreme Court because Georgia has their own laws. They can prosecute anybody they want to. Or as the old saying goes, they can press charges against a ham sandwich if they want to. Yeah, and Trump would be that ham sandwich, the pig that he is, the orange pig that he is. Yep, he's full of ham, he's full of baloney too, he's full of something else as well, ain't that right? Yep, it's full of BS. All right, let's go to our next story. This is Mark Sherman and Nicholas Riccardi writing for the Associated Press. This is dated February 6th out of Washington. From civil rights to privacy, the 14th Amendment has been a foundation for forging the norms of American law and democracy. But one of its provisions, adopted after the Civil War in 1868, has gotten almost no attention until now. That's Section 3, the part that's meant to keep former office holders who engaged in insurrection from ever regaining power. The Supreme Court on Thursday will be taking its first look at the insurrection clause in a case in which the stakes couldn't be higher. Donald Trump is the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination, but Republican and unaffiliated voters in Colorado argue that Trump is disqualified from being president again because he engaged in insurrection by trying to overturn his loss in the 2020 election, culminating in the January 6, 2021 traitorous attack on the U.S. Capitol. Once again, I added the word traitorous because that's what those people are. They are traitors. The Colorado case was one of several filed around the country seeking to block Trump from state ballots. The voters say that if Trump can't be president again, he shouldn't be on the ballot, and the Colorado Supreme Court agreed in a first-of-its-kind decision. The case seems certain to bring on a collision of law and politics that the Supreme Court typically likes to avoid, but in this case cannot ignore. Trump appealed the Colorado ruling, and the case will be argued on Thursday. The issue has come up elsewhere, but Colorado's court is the only one to rule against Trump. Maine's Democratic Secretary of State also has determined that Trump shouldn't be on that state's primary ballot. Both the Maine and Colorado decisions are on hold pending the outcome in the Supreme Court. The justices will be dealing with a handful of legal issues that include whether Trump did, in fact, engage in insurrection and whether the presidency is covered by constitutional provision at issue. Here's a look at the issues that the court will confront. Who decides? There are several ways in which the court could avoid a definitive ruling, even though both sides say it's vitally important for the court to make a final decision now about Trump's eligibility for the ballot. The justices could issue a ruling that applies only to Colorado or say the issue is not yet ripe for a decision. They also could conclude that the political branches of government and voters, and not the court, should decide whether to put Trump on the ballot. Trump's attorneys raised the prospect of a national checkerboard of presidential elections if the issue is left to politicians, where some states' leaders might allow voters to choose the likely Republican nominee and some might not. Attorneys for the voters trying to remove Trump from the ballot argued that the question is too important to be left to politics. It's one of following the plain language of the Constitution, which applies to everyone, regardless of how much political support they may have. Still, there's a way for the court to toss the question to one group of politicians that would work slightly differently. Does Congress have a say? Section 3 allows Congress to restore someone's eligibility by a 2/3 vote. But it says nothing about whether Congress has to do anything at the start of the process before states can start applying the provision. In 1869, after many people were already barred from office under the measure, Salmon Chase, the then Chief Justice of the United States, found that there has to be congressional legislation creating a process to find someone covered by Section 3. Chase was acting as an appellate judge in an era when justices rode circuit before the creation of federal appeals courts. A few months earlier, though, Chase took the opposite position in a case involving Jefferson Davis. Chase's contradictory assessments about Section 3, separated only by a few months, are, according to law professor Gerald Maglioka, quote, are almost impossible to reconcile, end of quote. Trump's attorneys and allies argue Congress needs to act rather than leaving eligibility decisions to what they contend could be partisan courts. The attorneys seeking to disqualify Trump contend that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is just like its other provisions, ready to be applied without the need for additional legislation. Some legal experts warn that kicking the fraud issue to a political polarized Congress is perilous. It might mean the issue is not dealt with until January 6, 2025, if Trump wins at the ballot box in November and Congress has to certify his election. One friend of the court brief filed by legal experts say that would, quote, risk catastrophic political instability, chance disenfranchising millions of voters, and raise the possibility of public violence, end of quote. Does the amendment even apply to Trump or any candidate for president? This is where things get technical. Section 3 reads, no president shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may vote by a 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. And that's the text of Section 3. Note what office isn't specifically mentioned in the text, the presidency or vice presidency. Trump's attorneys argue that means the provision doesn't apply to presidents. Well, it states clearly in Section 3, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States. Guess what? Trump is commander-in-chief, therefore officer. Sorry, that's the way it is. The only reference to other officials is officer of the United States, a term that appears elsewhere in the Constitution, and they contend doesn't apply to the president. I say it does apply. Tremendously. They also point out that the provision bars insurrectionists who took an oath to support the Constitution. At his inaugural, Trump pledged to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution in an oath in which the word support is nowhere to be found, his lawyer wrote. Well, what are you doing if you're preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution? You're supporting it. Duh! You can't separate the two. Finally, nothing in the text says someone can't be a candidate for these offices, so the court can't ban Trump from the ballot. The attorneys trying to remove Trump contend this is just clever wordplay. The Supreme Court, they note, has never agreed with the highly technical argument that the president is not an officer of the United States. The president isn't named in the text of Section 3, they argue, because the president is obviously an officer of the United States. Why, they ask, would the drafters of the 14th Amendment want to bar lower-level oath breakers from returning to office, but allow one to become leader of the country? As for the oath, they wrote the dictionaries from the time of the nation's founding and Civil War era list support and defend as synonyms for each other. If anything, they noted the president's oath is more demanding than mere support. And the core of their case is that state courts like Colorado's have a duty to ensure that only qualified candidates are on the ballot. That means they can strike Trump for violating Section 3, just as they would remove someone who didn't meet the constitutional standard of being a natural-born citizen. Did Trump engage in insurrection? This might be the least technical of all the aspects of the case, but it also is highly contested. Relying on the work of the congressional committee that investigated the January 6th attack, the lawyers arguing to keep Trump off the ballot recite volumes of evidence of Trump's actions that they say incited the deadly attack, including a speech on that same day in which he urged supporters to fight like hell. That is a direct quote. You got to fight like hell or you're going to lose this country, was pretty much the direct quote of the Orange Pig. They note that in the post-Civil War period, Section 3 was used against not only people who fought for the Confederacy, but against those who organized on its behalf and even issued rhetorical support for the uprising. Trump's attorneys counter that the congressional January 6th report is one-sided and that Trump in no way engaged in insurrection. They argue he didn't enter the Capitol, didn't tell his supporters to be violent, and called for them to be peaceful at one point in his speech on the ellipse, and then in two subsequent tweets. Yeah, those tweets coming several hours after the riot started, the traitorous riot. Instead, Trump's lawyers argue that he was simply engaging in free speech to talk about an election he honestly believed had been stolen from him. No, really? Oh my God, really? This is the most politically significant portion of the case. Even if the high court lets Trump stay on the ballot, the decision could play a major part in this year's presidential campaign if it has anything to say about Trump's culpability for January 6th. The Supreme Court, if it was stacked the correct way, which it isn't, would shoot down Trump's arguments right away. He would be barred from the ballot, and he would be gone, 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 baby. But no, this court is stacked with 3 Trump appointees who are going to stay loyal to him regardless of what the law says. Just take a look at their actions so far. They're going to stay loyal to Trump, period, end of story. That's what conservatives are. They will stick to each other like glue regardless of the circumstances, come hell or high water. That's just the truth. That's just the truth. It's been that way for the last 50, 60, 70 years, and it's going to continue being that way. Oh, no, we don't want Trump. When it comes down to it, if Trump is the only candidate, conservatives will vote for Trump, even though they support Nikki Haley, even though they support, other than a handful, a mere handful out of all the conservatives that there are, that would either vote for Biden or would sit out or would vote for a third-party candidate or none of the above or whatever, or would short their vote. In other words, they would vote down ticket and they would leave the top of the ticket blank, which is what happened in 2016 when 1.75 million voters in the United States, including a whole bunch of them in Michigan, to the tune of about 200,000 either voted for Bernie Sanders, who was not eligible, or voted none of the above, or just skipped the ballot. I believe it was about 140,000, not 200. I am sorry, let me correct myself there. But 1.75 million in this country said no to the major two-party candidates in 2016. And that's just the 33 states and District of Columbia that keeps those records. There's 17 other states that don't keep those records. So it was probably more. You know, folks, I'm just going to say it. If Trump gets elected, this country's over. I'm not being melodramatic. I'm stating the plain, honest truth. If Trump gets reelected, kiss this country goodbye. And I'll get into that in a story in just a little bit here. But let me go ahead to our next story. This is Michael R. Sizak writing for the Associated Press. This is dated February 6th out of New York City. The judge in Donald Trump's civil fraud trial is demanding more information after a key witness was reported to be in negotiations to plead guilty to perjury in connection with his testimony in the lawsuit. In an email posted to the trial docket Tuesday, Judge Arthur Engoron asked lawyers in the case to provide him with a letter, quote, detailing anything you know, end of quote, about the situation involving Allan Weisselberg, the former longtime finance chief at the Trump Organization. Engoron wrote, quote, I do not want to ignore anything in a case of this magnitude, end of quote. He suggested that he may disregard all of Weisselberg's testimony if he were to admit to lying on the witness stand. Engoron cited a February 1st report in the New York Times that Weisselberg was in negotiations with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office to plead guilty to perjury and admit that he lied on the witness stand when he testified at the civil fraud trial in October. The newspaper cited, quote, people with knowledge of the matter, end of quote. The Associated Press, citing two people familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity, reported that Manhattan prosecutors were weighing a potential perjury charge against Weisselberg. Engoron wrote in the email, quote, as presiding magistrate, the trier of fact, and the judge of credibility, I, of course, want to know whether Mr. Weisselberg is now changing his tune and whether he is admitting he lied under oath in my courtroom at this trial, end of quote. Engoron's email went to lawyers for Trump, Weisselberg, the Trump Organization, and other defendants, as well as counsel for the New York Attorney General Letitia James's office, which brought the civil fraud case. Messages seeking comment were left with Trump and Weisselberg's lawyers, as well as with spokespeople for the Trump Organization. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the Attorney General's office both declined to comment. Engoron asked the lawyers to respond by 5 p.m. Wednesday, adding that he wanted their thoughts on how he should address the matter, including timing of his final decision in the case, which court officials have said should be ready by mid-February. Weisselberg was one of 40 witnesses who testified over 2.5 months at the civil fraud trial, answering questions for 2 days about allegations that Trump lied about his wealth on financial statements given to banks and insurance companies. It wasn't clear what part of Weisselberg's testimony drew the scrutiny of prosecutors in the office of Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. Both Bragg and James are Democrats. The Times reported that prosecutors appeared to be focused on Weisselberg's claims on the witness stand on October 10th that he had little knowledge or awareness of how Trump's penthouse at Trump Tower came to be overvalued on his financial statements based on figures listing it as 3 times its actual size, which is 10,996 square feet. Weisselberg testified that he didn't pay much mind to the apartment's size because its value amounted to a fraction of Trump's wealth. Using a Latin term that means essentially too small to care about, Weisselberg said, quote, I never even thought about the apartment. It was de minimis in my mind. It was not something that was that important to me when looking at a $6 billion, $5 billion net worth, end of quote. Weisselberg said he learned of the Trump Tower penthouse size discrepancy only when a Forbes magazine reporter pointed it out to him in 2016. He testified that he initially disputed the magazine's findings but said he couldn't recall whether he directed anyone to look into the matter. State lawyer Louis Solomon asked, quote, you don't recall if you did anything to confirm who was right? End of quote. Weisselberg said he did not. He was still on the witness stand when Forbes, whose reporters had discussed the size disparity with Weisselberg and revealed it publicly in 2017, published an article on his website suggesting he had perjured himself. The article's headline read this way, quote, Trump's longtime CFO lied under oath about Trump Tower penthouse, end of quote. It said old emails and notes showed that Weisselberg had had extensive discussions with the magazine, trying to convince its writers that the penthouse was worth far more than they thought. In addition to being a witness, Weisselberg is a defendant in James's civil lawsuit. As punishment for his involvement in Trump's alleged fraud, James is seeking to permanently ban the retired ex-CFO from the real estate industry and corporate executive jobs in New York and strip him of his $2 million Trump Organization severance. Weisselberg served 100 days in jail last year for dodging taxes on $1.7 million in perks from the Trump Organization, including a Manhattan apartment, Mercedes-Benz cars for him and his wife, and his grandchildren's school tuition. Under a plea deal in that case, Weisselberg testified as a prosecution witness at the 2022 trial that resulted in the Trump Organization tax fraud conviction in connection with the same off-the-books compensation scheme. He is still on probation. Trump is paying his severance in installments and covering the cost of his legal bills. A new charge could put the 76-year-old Weisselberg behind bars again. Yeah, you're on probation and you perjure yourself, you're going straight to jail. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. The inquiry into Weisselberg's testimony in the civil lawsuit is separate from the criminal case that Bragg brought against Trump last year over allegations that he falsified company records to cover up hush money payments. That trial is scheduled to begin in late March. Yes, indeed. So Weisselberg might end up going to prison anyway. This is great news. Throw them all in. Put them in general population. Let's see how long they last. Sorry, I'm not in favor of white-collar prisons. That's ridiculous. If you commit a crime, you go to the same prison as somebody who has been convicted of criminal sexual conduct, murder, or any other crime. It's the same prison for everybody, period. Now, this is an older article, but I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway because this is some important stuff here. This is Jill Colvin writing for the Associated Press. This is dated November 12th of 2023. This is out of New York City. Listen to this, folks. This is what Trump intends to do if he gets back in the White House. And I'm going to tie this in to something else. A mass deportation operation, a new Muslim ban, tariffs on all imported goods, and freedom cities built on federal land. Much of the 2024 presidential campaign has been dominated by the myriad of investigations into Donald Trump and the subsequent charges against him. But with less than a year until Election Day, Trump is dominating the race for the Republican nomination and has already laid out a sweeping set of policy goals should he win a second term. His ideas and even the issues he focuses on most are wildly different from President Joe Biden's proposals. If implemented, Trump's plans would represent a dramatic government overhaul arguably more consequential than that of his first term. His presidency, especially the early days, was marked by chaos, infighting, and a wave of hastily written executive orders that were quickly overturned by the courts. Some of his current ideas would probably end up in court or impeded by Congress, but Trump's campaign and allied groups are assembling policy books with detailed plans. Here's a look at his agenda. Dismantling the quote-unquote deep state. Trump would try to strip tens of thousands of career employees of their civil service protections. That way they could be fired as he seeks to totally obliterate the deep state. He would try to accomplish that by reissuing a 2020 executive order known as Schedule F. That would allow him to reclassify masses of employees with a particular focus, he has said, on what he called, quote, corrupt bureaucrats who have weaponized our justice system and corrupt actors in our national security and intelligence apparatus, end of quote. Given his anger at the FBI and federal prosecutors pursuing criminal cases against him, Trump would probably target people linked to those prosecutions for retribution. Beyond the firings, he wants to crack down on government officials who leak to reporters. He also wants to require that federal employees pass a new civil service test. Yeah, because he can't go after the reporters. The reporters have First Amendment rights under the Constitution, and that is the right to protect their sources. Sorry, that's there. It's been ruled on a bunch of times. The U.S.-Mexico border, Trump has pledged to, quote, immediately stop the invasion of our southern border, end of quote, and end illegal immigration. As part of that plan, he says he would immediately direct U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to undertake the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. He would target people who are legally living in the United States but harbor jihadist sympathies and revoke the student visas of those who espouse anti-American and anti-Semitic views. In a bid to secure the U.S.-Mexico border, Trump says he will move thousands of troops currently stationed overseas and shift federal agents, including those at the Drug Enforcement Administration and the FBI, to immigration enforcement. He also wants to build more of the border wall that's already been a failure. Trump wants to reimpose his travel ban that originally targeted 7 Muslim-majority countries and expand it, quote, to keep radical Islamic terrorists out of the country, end of quote. In the wake of the Hamas attack on Israel, he has pledged to put in place ideological screening for immigrants. His aim? To bar, quote, dangerous lunatics, haters, bigots, and maniacs, end of quote, as well as those who, quote, empathize with radical Islamic terrorists and extremists, end of quote. To deter migrants, he said that he would end birthright citizenship using an executive order that would introduce a legally untested interpretation of the 14th Amendment. You know, the same 14th Amendment that Trump's trying to fight to stay on the ballot. The order would prevent federal agencies from granting automatic citizenship to the children of people who are in the U.S. illegally. It would require that at least one parent be a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident for their children to be eligible for passports, Social Security numbers, and other benefits. When it comes to trade, Trump said he will institute a system of tariffs of perhaps 10% on most foreign goods. Penalties would increase if trade partners manipulate their currencies or engage in other unfair trading practices. He will urge that Congress pass a Trump Reciprocal Trade Act, giving the president authority to impose a reciprocal tariff on any country that imposes one on the U.S. Much of the agenda focuses on China. Trump has proposed a 4-year plan to phase out Chinese imports of essential goods, including electronics, steel, and pharmaceuticals. He wants to ban Chinese companies from owning vital U.S. infrastructure in sectors such as energy, technology, and agriculture, and says that he will force Chinese owners to sell any holdings, quote, that jeopardize America's national security, end of quote. On foreign policy, Trump claims that even before he is inaugurated, he will have settled the war between Russia and Ukraine. That includes, he says, ending the, quote, endless flow of American treasure to Ukraine, end of quote, and asking European allies to reimburse the U.S. for the cost of rebuilding stockpiles. It is unclear whether he would insist that Russia withdraw from territory in Ukraine that it seized in the war that was launched in February 2022. Trump has said that he will stand with Israel in its war with Hamas and support Israel's efforts to destroy the militant group. He says he will continue to fundamentally reevaluate NATO's purpose and mission. I got news for Trump. It's not up to him to reevaluate NATO. NATO is more than the United States. It's the United States and most of Western Europe, buddy. This one should scare the hell out of everybody, especially transgender people. When it comes to transgender rights, Trump said that he will ask Congress to pass a bill establishing that only 2 genders as determined at birth are recognized by the United States. As part of his crackdown on gender-affirming care, he will declare that hospitals and healthcare providers that offer transitional hormones or surgery no longer meet federal health and safety standards and will be blocked from receiving federal funds, including Medicaid and Medicare dollars. He would push Congress to prohibit hormonal or surgical intervention for transgender minors in all 50 states. Doctors typically guide kids toward therapy before medical intervention. At that point, hormone treatments such as puberty blockers are far more common than surgery. They have been available in the U.S. for more than a decade and are standard treatments backed by major doctors' organizations, including the American Medical Association. So Trump would love to get rid of trans people. He would love to get rid of gay people. He is a homophobe. He is a bigot. He is a racist, a rapist, and a homophobe. You can quote me on that. I don't care if he tries to sue me. I've got freedom of speech, buddy. When it comes to energy, Trump's goal, he says, is for the U.S. to have the lowest cost energy and electricity of any nation in the world, including China. Under the mantra of drill, baby, drill, he says he would ramp up oil drilling on public lands and offer tax breaks to oil, gas, and coal producers. He would roll back Biden administration efforts to encourage the adoption of electric cars and reverse proposed new pollution limits that would require at least 54% of new vehicles sold in the United States to be electric by 2030. This is scary as hell, too. We're already having violent weather in this country. Just ask California, that's been flooding all week, getting a half year's worth of rain in 2 or 3 days. Unbelievable. I'm in Michigan right now. The temperatures have been in the 40s and 50s, near record highs. Records that have not been seen since the 1920s. This is scary stuff. I'm afraid this summer we're going to be Tornado Alley. It's not going to be the plains, it'll be the Midwest. You watch what I say. Continuing, and again he says he will exit the Paris Climate Accords, end wind subsidies, and eliminate regulations imposed and proposed by the Biden administration targeting incandescent light bulbs, gas stoves, dishwashers, and shower heads. When it comes to education, Trump has pledged to terminate the Department of Education, but he also wants to exert enormous influence over local school districts and colleges. He would push the federal government to give funding preference to states and school districts that abolish teacher tenure, adopt merit pay to reward good teachers, and allow the direct election of school principals by parents. He has said that he would cut funding for any school that has a vaccine or mask mandate and will promote prayer in public schools. Well, that's pretty much all the public schools in Michigan because that vaccine mandate comes from the state Department of Public Health, not from the school. Try again there, idiot. What an orange dipwad. Unbelievable. And the dipwad is not the word I want to use. I'm trying to keep the swearing down. Trump also wants to say in school curricula, vowing to fight for patriotic education, whatever that is, patriotic education. You mean propaganda. He says that under his administration, schools will, quote, teach students to love their country, not to hate their country like they're taught right now, end of quote, and will promote, quote, the nuclear family, end of quote, including, quote, the roles of mothers and fathers, end of quote, and the, quote, things that make men and women different and unique, end of quote. Yeah, the nuclear family. Let's see. Trump is on what number marriage now? 3? There was Ivana, there was Marla Maples, and now there's Melania. Melania. Sounds like malaria. I'm going to start calling her Malaria Trump. Screw her. Oh, wait. As a high-class escort, I'm sure she's been screwed a lot. My opinion. To protect students, he says he will support school districts that allow trained teachers to carry concealed weapons. That is terrifying. That is absolutely ridiculous. He would provide federal funding so schools can hire veterans, retired police officers, and other trained gun owners as armed school guards. For homelessness, Trump wants to force the homeless off city streets by building tent cities on large open parcels of inexpensive land. Except in Kentucky, because they're trying to get rid of tent cities. At the same time, he says he will work with states to ban urban camping, giving violators the choice between being arrested or receiving treatment. He also wants to bring back large mental institutions to reinstitutionalize those who are severely mentally ill or dangerously deranged. And those are direct quotes. Wow. I don't even know what to say about that. As somebody who has mental illness, that's scary as hell. Because who defines what's severely mentally ill or dangerously deranged? Who qualifies as that? Who makes that qualification? I'd like to know. Jesus Christ. And public safety. Oh, this ought to be good. Trump would again push to send the National Guard to cities such as Chicago that are struggling with violence. That's terrifying, too. He would use the federal government's funding and prosecution authorities to strong-arm local governments. He says he will require local law enforcement agencies that receive Justice Department grants to use controversial policing measures such as stop and frisk, which has been proved to be worthless, by the way. As a deterrent, he said local police should be empowered to shoot suspected shoplifters in the act. Wow. In one recent speech, he said, quote, very simply, if you rob a store, you can fully expect to be shot as you are leaving that store, end of quote. Wow. Trump really just doesn't care about anybody, does he? Except for his rich buddies. Unbelievable. Trump has also called for the death penalty for drug smugglers and those who traffic women and children. He has also pledged a federal takeover of the nation's capital, calling Washington a, quote, dirty, crime-ridden death trap, end of quote, unbefitting of the country. So Washington, D.C. is a dirty, crime-ridden death trap, really. Yeah. Oh, you don't even know how much I hate Donald Trump. I absolutely loathe him. Absolutely loathe him. One thing that wasn't mentioned in this article is what Trump and the Republicans want to do if they get the White House back in 2024. Tom Hartman mentioned this most recently on his show earlier this week. I believe it was his Tuesday show. According to Tom Hartman, and I believe him fully, what the Republicans and Trump want to do if he gets back into power with the 2024 election is that anybody age 65 who files for Medicare will automatically be signed up for Medicare Advantage, or as we call it on this show, Medicare Disadvantage, because it's neither Medicare nor is it an advantage. It's private health insurance. It's by Humana. It's by WellCare. It's by Aetna, Priority Health, you name it. It's all privatized insurance, healthcare insurance, privatized, that can make decisions on whether you receive a test, whether you get surgery, how much they're going to pay. When you have full-blown actual Medicare, there is none of that. If you need a test, you get a test right immediately. There is no red tape. There is no pre-approval needed. You need a test, you get it. It's like that with traditional Medicare. According to Tom Hartman, at this rate, if they do this, they will have 80% of the country signed up for Medicare Advantage, or as we call it, Medicare Disadvantage. There's already half of this country signed up. If they automatically start applying it to everybody that's now retiring, guess what's going to happen? They'll pull the plug on actual Medicare. There will be no more Medicare as we know it, which has worked beautifully since 1965. It's one of the most popular programs. It's one of the programs with the lowest percentage of fraud in it. There is hardly Medicare fraud. There's a bunch of fraud going on with Medicare Advantage because it's not Medicare and it's not Advantage. It's the private insurance companies lining their pockets, lining their executives' pockets, lining their shareholders' pockets. Jack Prince and I plan on having another meeting sometime soon to start explaining to more people, especially those that are starting to retire, getting ready to retire, what the actual difference is between traditional Medicare and quote-unquote Medicare Advantage. Because a lot of people don't know. A lot of smart people don't know. They look at you like they've got deer in the headlights. And they just are like, what do you mean? I signed up for Medicare. No, you didn't. You did not. It's unbelievable. So that'll happen if Trump gets in too, besides all the other things that I talked about. One final story I want to get to. This is Rebecca Santana writing for the Associated Press. This is dated February 7th out of Washington. This is a great story here. This is beautiful. The Republican-controlled House has failed to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas over the Biden administration's handling of the U.S.-Mexico border. The vote Tuesday night marked the culmination of months of examination by House Republicans as they've aimed to make migration and border security a key election issue. But when it came down to the vote, Democrats were united against the charges, and Republicans, who have a razor-thin majority in the House, needed almost every vote they had to approve the 2 articles of impeachment against Mayorkas. They fell short. This doesn't necessarily spell the end of the impeachment efforts. The House is likely to revisit the issue, but next steps are highly uncertain. So this is what happened. The Republicans, when it came up to vote, the vote tally was 215 to 215. It's actually, let me get to what happens next. It's not immediately clear the House is likely to revisit plans to impeach Mayorkas. The final vote was 214 to 216. 3 Republicans opposed the impeachment. A 4th Republican switched his vote so that impeachment could be revisited at a later date. If it remained a tie, it was a dead issue. In a dramatic, rowdy scene on the House floor, the vote was tied for several minutes at 215-215. Several Republican lawmakers surrounded one of the holdouts, Wisconsin Republican Mike Gallagher, who refused to change his vote. Speaking after the vote, Representative Mark Green, Republican of Tennessee, said he was frustrated. Green is the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee that brought the articles of impeachment, but Green also said, quote, "We'll see it back again," end of quote. If Mayorkas is eventually impeached, the issue would then go to the U.S. Senate. That's the body that would decide whether to convict the secretary or not. And if he's convicted, then Mayorkas is no longer Homeland Security Secretary. But a conviction is a much higher bar than impeachment. Democrats control the Senate 51 to 49. 2/3 of the Senate must vote to convict as opposed to the simple majority needed to impeach in the House. That means all Republicans as well as a substantial number of Democrats would have to vote to convict Mayorkas, a highly unlikely scenario considering some Republicans are cool to the idea of impeachment. And for good reason, because they have said, including the ones in the House that voted against it, they said, well, if this goes through, we're lowering the bar. That means any time that any one of us is doing something wrong in the eyes of the Democrats, they can impeach us. They can do that to the Supreme Court, members of Congress, anybody. And they're right. It would be going down, basically down the path toward Pandora's box, and they don't want to open Pandora's box. Mayorkas has said that he's ready to defend himself in the Senate if it comes to a trial. In the meantime, he says he's doing his job. During a recent interview with the Associated Press, Mayorkas said, quote, "I am totally focused on the work and what we need to get done, and I am not distracted by the politics," end of quote. Yes, and something needs to be done about the border, but something needs to be done about it through Congress, because they've got the power, and they're not willing to do it because Donald Trump might get hurt in the election. That's it for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.